Well, great to have all of you here. I enjoy the buzz in the air as everybody starts talking shop and experiences, but welcome on behalf of the chairs and our ex officio next house chair. Our time is getting short with Representative Snow, and it makes me sad.
You need to explain what that means, okay? So
Let me tell you what I'm talking about.
nothing terminal.
No criminal activity. But Representative Snow is not running again, so this will be next month. Well, January 1st is technically.
Don't try to move it up. It's the end of December. So.
Okay, we're gonna keep it. We're gonna keep it going as much as we can with it, and nothing says that you won't continue your input on this work, which you've been a champion for. So appreciate all of you coming. Those who are joining us online, welcome, and thank you for chiming in. And can you hear us okay? Lynn, Richard? Yeah, good. Okay, thank you. All right. Well, we'll call the meeting to order, and we're going to excuse Rich Christiansen, the Board of Higher Ed. He's en route from Egypt, so we'll probably not going to get reception over the Atlantic. Roxana Molina, a former student, is excused today, as well as Carrie Cochran, the board partisan pro, due to a conflict. But Carrie might be joining on Zoom, the dual tasking. So, all right. Does everybody have minutes in front of them? Just took a minute to look at those, and from our previous meeting of August. No, it was last August 24th. Yeah, that's right. So. Look at those, entertain a motion to accept those if anybody goes all right on that. Anybody want to make a motion to approve the minutes?
I would make that motion.
Thanks, Representative. Is there any discussion to that?
I'll take a second.
Second?
Second.
Thank you. All right, no discussion? Seeing none, we'll place that all in favor of accepting the approval of the minutes from our August 24th meeting. Please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? They rule that pass unanimously. Number 3 item on our agenda then. We'll turn some time to Jared with guiding objectives.
So in our last meeting, we spent a little time discussing what are we all about, what we're here for, and I'm gonna try to share it here so we can pull it up. Apologies for that. Okay. And so based on discussion last time and further feedback after the meeting, we took this back as we talked about and discussed it with the leadership, and came up with some new language and
No pressure. We've all sat in your shoes.
We've all done this.
Technology just
Okay.
goes out the door.
It is on here.
Yeah, yeah, maybe I'll just read it. In your attachment, last time we essentially had the first part of the statement. What actions and funding need to be applied for higher education and corrections facilities that will yield sustainable employment and something like the least likelihood of recidivism ended there. So with some of the discussion we had last time, the new language you'll see there is what actions and funding need to be applied or discontinued. That was a good suggestion to I'll just keep adding things. Applied or discontinued to provide for completion of higher education. So I'll focus on the end there. In corrections facilities that will yield sustainable employment and successful integration without recidivism. Will provide access, and then these parts were added, will provide access to educational opportunities beyond incarceration, and will provide an educational experience that's consistent with a college setting. And so in what we have here today, I underline the sustainable employment, successful integration. In my view, I think the more we can focus on these are the outputs that we're after. These other two are important, and they're part of that. These will help us to get to sustainable employment. They'll help us to have successful integration and reduce recidivism. But to also call them out and say, while we're doing it, let's make sure that we're lining things up for what happens post-release in education and be consistent with all policy. So that's the language we have there. And so Chair, that's recommend that we adopt that or discuss it or pleasure to council.
All right, thank you, Jared. So looking at the guiding objective, anybody have input on questions, concerns, or comments about that?
One thing I just want to say is I think one thing that's really important for me from this group and is to really be able to facilitate what are our policy or cultural changes that need to be implemented either legislatively or otherwise to be able to help create this culture and incentivize the inmates to really desire that. I think there's a lot of let's do things to appeal to the board and get the board to just get me out. And I think whatever needs to be adjusted within the culture to say, what is it that you want to really do in your life and accomplish, and how are we helping you? So I think that's what we want to be able to help complete programming and facilitate what your needs are, but everyone else's, right, as they get out. So that's what solutions are what we need. And this is a great time for opening for ideas that we can work together to achieve.
Anybody else?
I have a question about the language a little bit. So reading the section which is successful integration without recidivism, I'm trying to, I guess, let's see how to articulate this, understand how much of recidivism will happen, right? If we say, if this is specific portions that we have for students, equals, feels higher or lower, can we really eliminate it rather than mitigate it, right? So I'm just kind of.
Yeah, I see. Fair question.
Eliminate or
Mitigate, yeah.
So where he says without recidivism would be 0, if we dropped it 10, 20%, that's a success.
Yeah, so like, yeah, okay.
That's a good point. So that could be changed to reduce recidivism.
And I always like to remind us that it's not a lack of education alone that drives recidivism. It's a more complete picture of a variety of deficits and a lot of the drivers of criminal behavior based on deep trauma histories of abuse and neglect as people grow up that have to be addressed in addition to providing educational opportunities. And that's how you reduce recidivism. So it's not just a simple formula, let's get them an education and they'll be fine, right? It's a lot of things we have to do right and do well.
So then I wonder, sorry, for the sake of just having a clear understanding of what that is, that we could have like a terminology to understand what we're talking about.
I'm actually working on another group to define recidivism because different groups interpret that differently. So we're working on being able to put that in code of what the definition of that is. And I think that's going to help a lot.
And different states have chosen different definitions, and depending on if you want to count new crimes only, or if you want to count, new entries into the system. For those states that only count, new crimes, they look a lot better at recidivism rates. So, and I think we've sort of committed as an agency to report both, but just so that we can be compared fairly across states, right? Because often I think we're reported as among the worst in recidivism, but it's not actually true when you compare us apples to apples with other states and how they report it. And in fact, 3 years of post-release of how people behave and whether they come back into our system on a new charge or not.
Couple of things, going back to what Andrea says about education is only one factor. So I like to reduce recidivism, but maybe something like to help reduce.
Sure.
Which would indicate that this, at least I think arguably, sets out that this higher ed offering is one thing, and I assume you would agree with that, Andrea, that it can be a factor. In all of that.
It's a huge driver. In fact, the research is really compelling. If you get somebody to a master's degree, the recidivism rate is this, right? And it's not probably just the master's degree alone that's driving that. We just have to be clear about that, but it's powerful. So I don't want, I know I'm speaking on both sides of my mouth. I think education is one of the cornerstones of successful reentry. We can never ignore it. And I think we have to make sure that we're addressing some of those criminal thinking types of things that drive people into our system in the first place.
So if I may as well, so education is one of 8 factors
Yeah.
that affect recidivism as well. And when you break those 8 factors, there's actually 3 that they consider the dynamic factors, and that's their criminal thinking, the companions, and when I say companions, that's like hanging out with other deviant peers, and then their antisocial disorders that they're dealing with as well. And so if we don't reduce the risk in those areas, it's really hard to focus on education, even family and marital, some of those other issues. Me and Dan had a prime example this last week. So this guy, on paper, qualified for just a Davis Tech, just one of our vocational training programs. Planned on enrolling him, but Dan started getting just messages from other inmates saying, don't put this guy in. He's been talking on the housing unit. He just wants to use the training program to run drugs and make weapons. But he qualifies for a training program. But when you break down his other risk factors, the guy's a very high risk when it comes to his criminal thinking and his companions as well. And so by putting him into that program until we've addressed some of these other issues, we can actually cause more problems than good.
Yeah.
May I suggest that we, for next meeting, actually have parole come with some statistics of what their completion is in parole, and those who break parole and have to come back in, of what the breakdown is of that group of, are they drug users? Are they another kind of offender? What is that statistic? So that we can understand, since we are focusing on education, maybe there's certain groups that need a different type of education focus. So I'd like to propose that, to have parole come and report to us next week of their breakdown of what's actually happening in parole, and what we can do on our end to perhaps guide some of this focus that's in our purpose.
So are you asking for Dan Blanchard, Director over APMP, Adult Probation and Parole? And are you specifically interested in parole violators? Because that's a huge driver of our population.
I want to know who's completing and what those groups are, who's actually completing, and those that are not completing, what is their background, right? So I want to know if the type of offender is affecting who's completing parole or not, and what we can do on our side, since this is our focus, of addressing those population groups to make it more successful. I think we need those statistics and have parole actually come and tell us those things.
Yeah, so can I
Go ahead.
offer a possible amendment, a narrowing amendment? And that is, I'm believing, or I want to believe that for a study of all of the issues that affect parolees' success, where this group may be really very broad and helpful, but I would prefer that they focus on in the past what has been the role of education to assist with the success of parolee. Because otherwise, I think for corrections to make a full presentation on all of those issues may get us diverted. That's just the thought.
Well, and I think it's a combination of both, right? Of saying of those groups, which one was education an improving factor, right?
And I apologize for interrupting, but I wanted to continue my thoughts, if I could, getting back to the statement. The other thing I notice is we end the statement with a question mark. And I'm not certain we should do that. So, and the other thing is in looking at the statement, there is no personal element. And sometimes what I'm saying is, this sounds like a program, but we have not said for who is this to benefit. And it's a small thing, but I think we should not lose sight of that. And I'm not suggesting where that should be, but I'm going to say, for example, after completion of higher education correction facility, benefit inmates, or to benefit who, and help me out here, Andrew, do we just refer to them as inmates? Is that the best terminology? Or
Can I give you my favorite?
that's why I'm asking.
And it's controversial, so, but I really like returning citizens. Because I think it plants that seed of hope and it doesn't label them for the worst moment of their life for the rest of their life.
So I'm curious, Andrew, do you, when you speak to groups and that sort of thing, you refer to the folks that you oversee as returning citizens?
I do. I use it in our mission and vision statement for programming. I think it's important that we recognize that they're humans and they're people first and foremost. Even if it is in fact true that they carry felonies and that, I mean, they're already encumbered with that scarlet letter, if you will. So I just want to make it easier on them to transition back. I also think if you label somebody with the expectation that they're, you know, an offender, I mean, I find that terminology a little offensive personally, but it's typical, right? In our setting, that's what most people use. And so, you know, I get that that's part of our culture. I just feel the need to start sort of stepping away from that distinction and call people. I think it's fine to use the term people or returning citizen because I like the hopefulness of that. But that's up for you guys. I mean, I'm one small bit.
Well, my main, and by the way, I like that, but my main concern is we personalize this mission statement.
Yeah.
With referring to those somehow that this is intended to help. And so anyway, that's my comment, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And I appreciate that discussion. For any further, and I possibly, Representative, we could just take off the what, we're talking about actions and funding needed to be applied. What, and remove the question mark. Just reword that a little.
Right.
And I also like on the second line, higher education and correction facilities that will help yield sustainable employment. We can't guarantee, but it'll maybe improve that factor or ability, and the percentages will go up. So if we help yield sustainable employment and successful integration, and hopefully without recidivism, that probably needs to be.
We could just cross that out because successful integration
There we go.
presumes.
That's what I was gonna say too.
Oh, thanks, Dave. Okay.
That's just a measure of integration, right?
It is.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we just took out without recidivism, but will provide, or we're working on how do we word it from there?
I finally found it, so I got it on the screen. If that helps.
Okay.
I was just suggesting it could be, yeah, take actions to, starting it that way. Take action to recommend funding. I like some of the changes on here.
Yeah, I think we have to be mindful of our role. I think the statute, we don't have authority to do any of these, but our role is to recommend things to the board and the legislature, right?
Yes, that is
And
right.
as well as
I got some
coordinate.
clarity around that.
Well, part of the statute is to coordinate the education.
Perhaps,
Go ahead.
can we perhaps just break it down to bullet points and that way it'll be easier to read?
Yeah.
And we don't have to have a long guiding objective, we have multiple ones. Right, that will help us kind of just wordsmith this a little bit more.
I was just gonna observe that removing the reduced recidivism clause, really, the successful integration ties in perfectly with returning citizens there. It's a nice, connection.
And I appreciate that. And with any work we do, also acknowledge that in a lot of degree and a lot of measure, depending upon each individual, returning citizen, I like that. that there is already success. We're not a zero. We're trying to increase that success, find the gaps, as mentioned on the next strategic priority, but what we can do to make sure, and we have a change coming up, right? Everybody, we'll get into that later, but with Pell opportunities, I think that can help us when it says we'll provide an educational experience that goes beyond. So even during parole, probation, or even afterward, I would imagine all, if not all, most returning citizens would qualify for the trauma scholarship. Because they just need, and that the driver is that you have to have at least a GED or diploma to get that. So there's one of your incentives. And I have to think that it's already an incentive, even though it pleases the board, but having some type of programming under your belt, that's gotta look good. If I want to please the board, put something on my resume. So I think some of that's probably built in, but whatever more we can do. Okay.
Sure.
Go ahead,
Yeah, being an obsessive compulsive editor myself, I could probably go on a long time on the word. But if you like, I would be happy to make a motion that we adopt this language with just some flexibility to clean up some of the wording.
Where needs to be to provide halfway down. To provide access. Will provide, right after the.
After the cross out.
Right here, to provide,
Oh,
instead of to provide,
yeah, we've got some redundant words in here, so.
yeah. Okay.
Okay. So motion is to adopt this, and it doesn't say it
In other words,
can't be a
and
change.
now we're talking about it every
Yeah.
day, our marching orders.
All right. So with these changes, consistent with what we're trying to accomplish as a team, a committee, commission, everybody okay with that? Any further concern? Okay, we have a motion, a second. Further discussion? Okay, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, if any? Okay, we're in passage unanimously, and we'll appreciate that, Jared. Then the next thing, keep going with our guiding objective, and now are you sharing along strategic priorities, or are we going to Chris?
We're going to Chris.
Okay. All right, Chris, I know you've been busy, and I appreciate your work that you're doing. Item number 4, we'll actually loop back to item 3 eventually, but we have this guiding objective. Now we're going to hear from Chris, and who else do you have, Chris, that's reporting with you?
And so I'm going to kind of speak on behalf of the research and data work group, just for facility's sake. So the research and data work group was composed of myself and Andrea Parrish and Edith Lopez, Andy Eisen, who's joining us on Zoom, Aaron Castro from the University of Utah, and I want to thank Deputy Warden Jackson for his input, which was really, really invaluable as we went through this process. So that's who we are as a work group. Our charge was to present best practices and recommendations when it comes to higher education in-prison programs on the basis of a review of the scholarly literature and what other successful programs do in other states. Just a kind of, I guess, sort of philosophical note on the way we approached our work. I don't think the research and data work group is composed of kind of Pollyanna-ish people. I've never been accused of being overly optimistic about more or less anything. But it's also true that I think to a person, we all tended to believe that Utah is a proper place, has lots of advantages, lots of momentum as far as this movement goes. And so what we didn't want to do was sort of recommend half measures. So we were fairly aggressive in kind of articulating the best practices that we saw and the recommendations that we made. And so I hope you'll kind of bear that in mind. So what I hope we'll be able to do, I'll kind of walk you through one best practice with quite a number of I think interesting implications. And we have 6 broad recommendations. And my hope is that my talking will be at a minimum, and then we'll be able to have a really good discussion about what those recommendations might entail. So if I can, let me kind of walk through some of this. All right. So again, these best practices and recommendations are made on the basis of a review of the scholarly literature and our engagement with other prison education programs nationwide. I myself happened to have been in Chicago last month for other purposes. Wound up meeting in person with a number of people associated with Northwestern University's prison education program, which is kind of in the same boat as we are. They're just sort of launching a 2+2 program that involves a really great tech ed, their version of SLIC, Oakton Community College, really quality institution, and then Northwestern University. And so in any case, I think we had a pretty broad kind of sense of what's going on in the rest of the country. This is the best practice, the kind of single most important best practice that we found. And that is that higher education in prison should resemble higher education on a college or university campus as much as possible. So in other words, institutions, whether universities and colleges or the state, shouldn't simply see the prison as something that is segregated from all of its other educational efforts. It is part and parcel of those efforts. Now, that comes with a whole host of, I think, of interesting implications, that best practice. We've listed a few of them here as a group. The first is that instructors should have the same qualifications and expertise as those on main campuses. Coursework should be equivalent in rigor and should take place primarily in person. That is the case that, for example, at my institution, BYU, about 70% of our students at one time or another take an online class. The vast, vast majority of instruction, however, takes place in person. They're very good. There's quite a lot of data to suggest that that's massively preferable. The other thing I'll suggest is that it's preferable as people leave educational institutions. So just as a piece of anecdotal evidence, I was mentioning this earlier, I happened to be the guy in our department who taught exclusively on Zoom for the first year of the pandemic, which was a waking nightmare, as you might imagine. I have a big file on my work laptop of letters of recommendation that I write for exiting students who are doing whatever it is they're doing, jobs, law school, et cetera, et cetera. I write those for all kinds of students in my big classes, in my little classes. There is an almost total gap in that file on my computer from the Zoom year. Sure. I don't know who these people are. So that is something to kind of consider as we sort of approach that implication of this best practice. Incarcerated students should have the same institutional choices as other students. So all higher education in the prison setting is higher education. Davis Tech, SLIC, University of Utah in our case. Incarcerated students should have access to time and materials needed to attend classes and complete coursework, just like other students. They should have access to supporting technology, which would include, in our case, tablets, ideally online access to libraries, which would have been a huge help in the courses that I teach in learning management systems, by which we need things like Canvas and so forth. Incarcerated students should also have access to academic advising, TA help, and other resources available on main campus. So that best practice is it's sort of a simple statement, right? Higher education inside should look like higher education outside, but it carries with it a whole host of implications. Okay, yes, go ahead.
The last statement you made, when you look at these, it's a lot of implication. I mean, from a reality standpoint, how do we ever get to the point that a person serving in a correctional facility would ever get to the point to have the same choices as a student? You know what I'm saying?
Of course.
These are really aspirational, but some distance may be from reality. That's why it's really not a statement, it's a question.
Yep, no, fair enough. So I think one approach that's really useful is to look to other really successful programs. So just as an example, the one that many of us are fairly familiar with, the BARD Prison Initiative in New York State.
That was the video I shared.
Yes, of course, it's one of that documentary is one of the reasons I do what I do in the prison.
Wait just a second. Did we all get that, or was that part of it?
I believe everyone received
Okay.
a invitation to review this. It's a 4-part series, so it's a lot, it's a time commitment, but I also highlighted some video clips just to give you a flavor of it, and they're gonna show a little bit on Friday if you're going to the higher education, no, just the education and corrections
Yeah.
meeting
Megaplex.
at the Megaplex, yes. So
Wow,
please come.
okay, I should have kept my mouth shut because it just.
No, it's.
I'm glad you asked about it.
So,
It's really impressive. If you want to like a little bit of a tearjerker and feel inspired about the work you do, just watch it.
Right.
I think we forwarded that out to everybody just a couple of days after the office.
Yeah, yeah, because that was one of my homework
So you might
assignments.
look for that. It probably looked like a different topic or something. I can't remember. It was a reply.
We
to
can
it.
send it out again independently.
This is where I usually say, oh, it must be in my spam.
No.
so, but the gist representative is that Bard College is this kind of goofball college actually in New York State that has a long-standing prison education program. Does it offer incarcerated students who matriculate via Bard all of the choices that a Bard College student has on the main campus? Not quite.
Yeah.
Does it offer a massive complement of majors and courses of study and so forth? It does. Wow. So yes, this is all aspirational, but again, that was part, I guess, of the sort of philosophical bent of our committee, and it's Utah's proper place. Shoot for the top.
Good. Well, aspirational, maybe for us, but it's being attained. We're.
It is possible.
So,
If I could, another piece that I think about when I think about having the same access, I know that for the technical colleges, and this may be true of the others as well, because I'm not familiar with that, but their accreditation requires that if they're gonna do something anywhere else, it has to have the same access
Right.
program. And I don't know how deep they go into that. I think it's program specific.
Yes.
So if you're gonna offer welding, it's gotta be the same welding you have with it.
It
You
is.
may or may not have all of the, well, you have to have some person as well, so some of that's required. But I guess some of the reality. That if I'm a regular student and I live here in Salt Lake City, I go anywhere. I don't know how many thousands of these students I can go to. I can sign up for them, I can apply for them, I could travel to them, I could take them online. That's not gonna be possible in incarcerated. So, and I think some of the health guidelines that we're gonna talk about later might address some of how do we manage those kinds of limitations, but I'd love to just have the universe available to everybody. How do you read?
Yeah, of course, and
Yeah.
it is the case that for any student on the outside, there are limitations to what that person can do as far as higher education goes too, right?
Yeah.
Those, they're financial, they're geographical, they're familial, and so on and so forth. So it's the case that everyone is confronted with those limitations, and I concede the point that the limitations inside the state prison are substantial. That being said, to the extent that the best practice is, to the extent that an incarcerated student wants to go to Davis, Texas, or the University of Utah, the best practice is that we figure out a way for them to be able to do those things.
okay.
And I look at that list on there, and I think really everything, the one we probably most struggle with is number 2. We have some instructional choices of students. It may be that we're going as far as, you know, if we're gonna have a technical education choice, a community college choice, a university choice, how do we best
And
figure that, even if we don't have all the institutions?
agree.
But they're also transferable to other institutions when they get out.
And I agree, and that's probably the wrong
And I think they're gonna get to that.
verbiage, right? So rather than institution, in other words, I'm not suggesting that a person in the Utah State Prison should be able to go to DU or BYU or Harvard, right? It's a choice of what path to follow. Do you want to go to Davis Tech? Do you want to go to Slick AAS? Do you want to get a bachelor's degree? That's the program study choice. that should-
Right, and I think emphasis should be placed on the quality of the instruction and the learning, because that's where the results are derived. And our ambitious target should be to add variety as we're able to, as we're resourced to, right?
Absolutely.
Chris, thanks for letting me interrupt.
Oh, no, anytime. Okay, moving along, get to recommendations. Now, this is where things will get a little more gnarly. Okay, recommendation number 1. As a prelude to collaboration with policymakers and the state legislature, Governor Cox should issue a statement that commits Utah and its institutions to supporting higher education in the prison system. Now, I'll admit that my initial language was, I was operating on the throw a haymaker first principle, and I said executive order and was talked down by a number of people who know better than I do. That being said, this is a move that has been used in other states. Specifically, we're thinking of Tennessee, of all places. In some respects, politically sort of similar to Utah, where the Governor Bill Lee has done a version of this, where he's issued a statement kind of committing the state and its institutions to this process. And we as a research group think of that as a very solid recommendation to kind of remind not just the state and its institutions, but the state and its people, what the new prison is actually for, why it was constructed.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So I know that we're talking here about educating our returning citizens, but I want to know, how about educating our citizens? Because is that part of our focus as well, for people to understand that this is good for the community as well, to have people that are reintegrated and properly educated to return to normal life? I think that, is that part of our mission, Commissioner? I would think it would be. So maybe public service announcements might be helpful as well, just an idea.
I would say to that, it is something that I would guess that Governor Cox would put in that statement, is that here's not that it's not there now, but okay, we have a new president, an opportunity to announce this. Here we are, and we're committed to it. And here's the data that shows, if you have a master's degree, 0, here's the data that education really helps. So we know this is one of 8. I think he would put that in a statement. It's one of 8 factors, but it's a big one, and we're going to recommit to it. Yeah.
I think the more you feed the governor to say, here's some things to include in it, the more that those things will be in it. So I don't know if somebody's gonna take the bull by the horns and do that, and then one of us can give it to the governor and say, will you do this? But somebody can put some bullet points that they'd like to have in there, and then we'll pass it on.
I think it's worthy of a sit down with the governor, but I
I
would
think so
even
too.
go further and say, regardless of what they've done in Tennessee, I would like to see a joint statement from the governor and from legislative leadership, from our Senate president and the House Speaker, which sends a message directly to lawmakers, whereas the governor sends a message to citizens at large. And I think that's something that could be accomplished, and I think that would be a direct outgrowth of the work of this council.
I really like that, Chris. So thank you. We'll take that recommendation. I'm actually meeting with Neil Abercrombie of the governor's office next week on this, on corrections and a little bit about what our work is. So if I can make sure I get these from you, I'll kind of start that conversation so that when we are ready as a committee to offer that language, then it's not a surprise. Okay. Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, you're welcome. All right, recommendation number 2. Utah System of Higher Education should create a higher education articulation map for incarcerated students.
Julie already have one, right?
So do you mean their ability to transfer to other programs?
That's right.
Yes.
So the idea basically is,
And articulation, I'm not sure if I understand the term, and you're using it there, what is that?
it's a goofy term of art in academia that I don't know what it means either, but in any case, it basically just means how you get from one institution
Like
to
credit,
another.
like credit
Yeah,
swap?
credit moves
Credit
the
swaps.
transfer.
So
It's basically
it's
a degree.
So if you're taking a specific math class, but
Yeah,
that was transferring to a specific institution.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing that I hear in faculty meetings and just glaze over too, so I'm
So even though they might be in corrections and working on programs, that means wherever they would be released to in the state, they could have those
So
credits.
they've met their generals or to transfer.
Yeah, or they started welding wherever, whatever other welding program, it would count towards that program.
So after Christopher presents this next slide, I'll fill you in on what some of those articulation efforts are.
It's just another way in which we tee up people to be successful and eliminate barriers.
So our recommendation is, and we've kind of looked at different programs and what they do and so forth. And basically the recommendation is that it's available online, probably hosted in some way or another by USHE in the most straightforward possible format for persons such as myself who are not especially good at that sort of thing, and in a kind of printable PDF format that's easily transportable into and out of the prison. And again, the objective is to sort of allow people to walk through the process from high school / GED and our instructional partners inside the prison for those degrees through Davis Tech, through SLIC, and on to the bachelor's degree path at the University of Utah, so they know every step of the way. And there is, of course, a transfer articulation guide available online for the broader system, the utahtransferguide.org. It's worth kind of poking around on that website to see what these things are like. Again, I think it's, and we think it's a best practice and a recommendation of our work group that there be a specific one tied to higher education.
Yes.
So, just so folks in the room know, we have been working very hard to create articulation maps for associate and bachelor degree programs across the system. So by the time that work is finished, which is sometime in the next couple of years, we will have 85% of the bachelor's degrees in the system have an articulated lower division pathway. So a student can start at any of the UC degree granting institutions and transfer to any of the others that offer the bachelor's degree in that particular major, with the guarantee that if they already have the associate's degree, they can complete the bachelor's degree with 2 years of full-time study. So no excess credits, they'll know exactly what they have to take to complete that major. So there's that effort. The next effort is to align tech college programs with degree programs. We're starting with some of the most obvious alignments there: nursing, computer science, the things that do have a clear academic match, and are mapping out those agreements. So for nursing, for example, we started with Bachelor of Nursing programs, worked backwards to associate nursing programs to see what students would have to take to successfully make it into the bachelor program, and then back to the LPN and CNA programs at the technical colleges. So those pathways will be clearly mapped out. That work is well underway. Bullet point number 2, creating better messaging for high schools, students, for folks with GEDs, so that they can see all of these pathways even before they enroll at our institutions, is another effort that's currently starting in partnership with USDP to make those pathways much clearer. And we can definitely make sure that those materials, once they're developed, are available to non-public ed populations as well. And then we do have the fabulous Utah Transfer Guide tool, which it oversees. But what I had not put in my head until I saw this slide was a lot of these efforts are focused on online resources, and the fact that those should also be in a printable PDF format is something that I will definitely pass on, because the transfer guide is fully online, but our degree articulation maps could definitely be made into PDF versions.
But the question maybe for the corrections folks. But pretend like we have some advisors in the facilities, right? Do they have access to the internet, the staff, the advisors? Okay, so if they're working with a student, they could get into that transfer guide. They could also have some free PDF things they could hand out that are just kind of package ready, but if they need to dig in or dive in, can they do that in the presence of the student?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, there is ways in which we could allow some careful access to the internet for everyone who's incarcerated. It's not, that's not, supervised or carefully screened and monitored. It's not a hard no. So I don't want us to think that's not possible. It's just challenging.
But it is available in the facility to at least the staff.
Yeah, and that would be great. And one of the benefits of giving people access to the transfer guide is they can actually pull up their transcripts, and the computer analyzes their transcripts for them to find their best transfer options. So it's a personalized tool.
So, I have a question, because at least for the time being, my impression is that what we're able to do and offer currently for higher ed is somewhat limited. I mean, we hope to expand, but my question is this: is it possible that while you're arriving at the 2 years for the entire system, is there something that could be done within higher ed to approve some, an articulation map that provides a path now for inmates? Do you understand my question?
Yeah, I think those paths probably currently exist. I think if Eden and I went through the programs that are currently in place at the prisons, we could demonstrate what those are.
Yeah, so, and a side note, so along with that, we have to make sure that the way the transfer guide works is that a student will go in and log in and you know, basically have an ID number or an email from a specific institution of higher education in Utah, then those records, their transcripts kind of come in, right?
Okay.
So there's a question of like, you know, the email stuff that we could talk about later down the road, the technology and students inside the prison. The other part is that we have to know what, like Julie said, programs are offering the courses to know specifically what those pathways will be. Specifically, we're talking about transfer, we're talking about associates of arts, social science, right? We're talking about specific courses that need to be offered and programs have to offer specific courses to meet those requirements. So I think that evaluation will help us understand also what's currently being offered and what's not being offered, as well as figure out like, you know, how will it fit into the transfer guide.
Okay. So,
Thank you, go ahead. Sorry, I cut you off.
and I think I understand, but as it stands right now, if I'm there and I take English 100, from, I'll say Salt Lake Community College, and I don't know whether they call that, but you know, the basic entering college freshman English. And I complete that, and then there's an offer at University of Utah for English 200, which is a literature and a writing class. Is there a way for me, at some point, is someone going to say to me, well, I'm sorry, the Salt Lake community, that credit doesn't count, but the university, you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, so that's when we talk about articulation, that's what we talk about. The specific courses, gen courses, the students taking at SLIC.
Okay,
The writing, the math, the sciences, so on and so forth.
but it counts.
It counts.
It's general ed, right?
It counts as general ed, it counts.
Okay.
It's count, and it's even better if we package it in an associate's degree, associates of arts, social science, because then, you know, it comes together as a whole package, whole. That we don't have to evaluate it
Okay.
individual course individual.
So is that what Chris refers to as the 2+2?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And the entire system has a common course numbering agreement, so all of the English courses at all of the institutions, particularly in lower division, first and second year classes have the same course number and the same expected learning outcomes, and those courses do transfer between all of the institutions.
And
So we are-
just to specify currently the way the system is set up, students at Salt Lake Community College inside the prison can first earn a certificate of general education. And that, we have many that have accomplished that at this point. And that covers all of the general education requirements if they were to transfer to any of the 4 institutions in the state of Utah. So it counts for all of them.
And that, excuse me, sir, but that attainment remains in place.
Yes.
Okay, and there was a time where we didn't have that in our system.
And to that point, sorry, former school counselor here, it has evolved well, the articulation has. But, and I love this recommendation, but to me, this is a gap. I'm being told like right now in Gunnison facility, 25 students are taking what 250 used to take. Who helps? Is the map look, an inmate can look at that and say, oh, I know how to get from here to there. How do they do that? They're not, that can't happen alone. Go ahead.
So I just went to the website and my first thought is, wow, this is only in English, it's a lot of text. I don't see it super user friendly. Maybe a little short video explaining things to me would be helpful. Maybe applying it in Spanish. It really needs a little map that goes 1, 2, and 3. I can read it, but I have a law degree and I can understand it, but I know normal people may not be able to follow it. You're supposed to use it in conjunction with an advisor according to the
Yeah.
website, and that would be helpful as a school advisor to help me. But I would be better for me to be laying in my bed at night, looking at this and understanding it better.
Thank you.
So that's my takeaway.
And part of that is, do we have adequate counselors? We've talked about this before as a commission. Do we need more counselors? Is that part of a recommendation coming up, or would you say?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what already happened.
Yeah.
And if we're operating on the kind of best practice or principle, again, that
Oh, yeah.
on the inside should mirror the outside. I myself have a 21-year-old son who's a computer science major at the University of Utah, and he's asked me about kind of certain pathways forward, and I can't make heads or tails of it. And I tell him to go talk to his advisor because that person knows how to do all this stuff, but I
And
don't.
even the IRS does videos. 'Cause
Sure.
They recognize that getting to the whole population to understand something. Sometimes you can write it all out, but a verbal cue is a lot easier to comprehend.
And we have deployed our tablets to allow our case managers and individuals to be able to communicate about questions. I see no barrier to using the tablets also to communicate to an academic advisor when people are stuck, right? If they're assigned one. And we can create restrictions and parameters, in fact, we use it for our clergy as well. So we can create how many they can send out, right? They can't lambast somebody with a million questions. We can say, okay, every day you get 1 or 2.
So with advices, just quick clarifications, in case for those that are not familiar. I used to be an academic advisor in college, actually. Yeah. So you create a detailed plan. And one of the things that comes with that detailed plan is you explain to students how you're going to go from point A to point B, right? What degree you're looking for, how you get there, what are your options, what are your pathways. So the paper form will be really helpful as an initial launch to explain, because there's also a lot of information needs to happen. I mean, as a first year college student, I had to learn as I went. Right? There are 2 classes that I should have never taken, but nevertheless, I'm here. So that's what we want to do. We want to make sure that the students have that type of information available and it's explained. So there's 2 fronts. Not only you giving them the information, but you're explaining it. You walk them through that information. It's very important because that's what we do. We do in higher education and any other program, right? So the paper form will work really well. And then as students are becoming aware of how credit circulation happens, the online format is also going to be helpful, because then if there's access in the prison for that and supervised behind the wall, however you want to do it, then that means the student could, go in there and look around and play around on their time. Yeah.
Okay. I like that. And you know what, I have to just step back. When I talk with citizens who have re-entered, that this overwhelming message that I get that is a blocker, a barrier for them, is hope. There's no hope. And so anything like this that provides that pathway of hope, and they can see it. And it might be there, but if we don't bring attention to that, then I think that, and I just throw their hands up, I would too. So like you go see your counselor, so we might, we need to probably bring that in as we commit with the governor and the legislature. You're also going to have the support to make it happen. Okay, thanks, Chris. Go ahead.
You're welcome. All right, recommendation number 3. USHE and this committee should organize and implement a standardized collection of program data from all current participating institutions. So there's very good reasons, I think, that this is a good goal. It's going to facilitate just better coordination among the different programs, right? And hopefully foster degree completion. The basic data and that we would want and need would involve student enrollment, retention, attrition, conferral. And finally, and this is the last recommendation, suggests that incarceration status should be reflected in the state's standard educational tracking infrastructure, which could then reflect long-term outcomes for those with post-secondary education while incarcerated. So basically, this is, there's a bunch of stuff going on this slide, but the gist is that we need proper standardized data that assesses what's going on in each program, that is legible among the programs. programs so that we are better coordinated.
Question?
And I think that's one of the issues that's highlighted in the legislation.
Yeah. And
Generally, not this specifically.
right.
Yes, it alludes to that, but the idea that we would be getting to this.
And just as a kind of side note, one approach that a couple of folks, I'll send you this slide. A couple of folks that, okay.
No,
No, you
that's what I want. I got you in it.
One of the, I think, best practices that we've sort of come across as we've talked to folks in other programs is that often programs will build, and often these are situated at a university, a kind of research and data committee that is composed of faculty members and so forth in medicine and statistics and so on and so forth, who have some expertise in those issues and articulate with the community colleges and so forth to kind of build the rubric or the data instrument for collection. The other thing I'll say, and I'd be remiss if I didn't, and I can't believe I'm going to say this out loud and in public, but this data should also include student evaluations of teaching, which are the bane of many of us faculty members, as you know, and they have some real limitations that we can talk about, but they are an important tool for assessing what the incarcerated students are getting from the instruction we're giving. So I think that's, much as it pains me to say.
There's also nothing that would prohibit us from adding an additional tailored evaluation to talk about how delivery is working within the.
Great.
Great.
Okay.
Okay.
These sound like conversations for the UC data team and the correction data team. And Representative Miller, I think there's some people here as well. On the correction side.
All right, recommendation number 4, in the tradition of college and university accreditation processes, this committee, or council rather, should initiate a third-party evaluation of all higher education programs for undergraduate students. So as many of you know, universities and colleges are reviewed and assessed quite frequently. University assessments and college assessments for the whole institution occur with some frequency via an accreditation body. In the case of folks here in Utah, it's the Northwest Council of Colleges and Universities, or whatever that is, the acronym. And then even colleges and departments within universities and colleges are assessed. I'm about to endure my department's periodic assessment myself. These are tremendously useful. They bring together outside experts to give a kind of, again, outsider view of the quality of programming and so on. Here are the basics that we sort of think this third-party evaluation ought to assess. Of course, overall program quality. What's the quality of instruction? Does it meet the kind of standards of rigor that you would anticipate on the basis of what degree is being offered? Recruitment and enrollment processes, access to resources, including space and technology, data evaluation, including our collection instruments and needs and gaps. And the most likely kind of format for this that we see, although this would obviously be something that the council would kind of negotiate. I know a few folks who run prison education programs, such as Andrea, Angie Eisen, and Aaron Castro know all of them. So there's a kind of pretty rich reservoir of folks that we can invite to engage in this kind of work. And again, it's simply in keeping with the, not to do the drip method, but the best practice, the kind of guiding principle that this should mirror what goes on the outside to the extent that that's possible.
Sure. Chris, is there are people outside that we could call on, but is there any organized association or group that actually does this?
Not so far as I'm aware, specifically for prison education programs.
Okay.
So there's no equivalent of the Northwest, thing or whatever. That being said, it would really be no, I don't want to say no trouble. I think it's eminently possible that we could find a really, really excellent group of evaluators to do this work who have expertise in prison education and nationwide.
Does that require funding?
Yes.
Yes.
So that should probably be included in my bill, the file that's open,
I
right?
would, yes, please.
Okay.
Along with the
So-
counselors.
We're thinking something different for dental accreditation. For, Dan, I know that Council on Education does your accreditation, considers your place a site of the institution, and they send site visitors out. They're doing.
They do just
maybe
that.
all of it, more. We're thinking something that's specific to prison education, perhaps beyond that, or that could be it, or.
It will be
complement that.
someone, so there's people in the field that actually do this kind of work. So I think like Chris mentioned, it's not like a different test to figure out in the field, but it's just to look at overall where you need some work, where you have improvements, where you need additional resources. And there's definitely people around that do this kind of work. The Lions for Education was one of them. I don't know if they do it now. But there's people we could look up to. I'm sure Andy and Dr. Ann Castro might know some, but there's definitely specifically for higher education for prison.
And I believe that with Second Chance Pell, UDC is, the corrections is going to be required to do some kind of assessment.
Yeah, so
Of, are we achieving results in the prison education
Yeah.
program?
So
So maybe that becomes part of that, I don't know.
yeah, so the FITs haven't released the actual matrix yet of those programs they're gonna participate in Second Chance Pell Grants. So once they release it, then we will know specifically the data that we need to collect. And that should be happening for the next month or 2 hours.
Okay, question on that, though, how long would that, something like that take?
That could take, depending on how many programs and how, and you know, that's, and how, and how the type of degrees you offer, it could take about a year. Depending on what you have, so depending on how many programs we have, I mean, it could be 6 months, it just, it depends.
So you can't get that into legislation now, but.
So it'll be for next
We can get
fiscal
recommendations,
year, yeah.
maybe get things in
And
place.
how often do these third-party evaluations need to take place?
So it depends on the state. So, for example, I think it's Colorado that's doing it right now. So Colorado right now, they have a series of programs that are applying for the Second Chance Pell Grant, and they are going to start doing their first annual review. So I'm assuming it's going to happen every 2 or 3 years, depending on the state. Tennessee is also has done it in the past, and I believe, I know my, just can't remember.
What do we
I don't remember
want?
what I-
We want it every 2 to 3 years? What do
Yeah.
we want?
That's a good question, and university accreditation at the highest level happens a little less frequently than that. But departmental kind of review and so forth happens more frequently, so I think there's gotta be a balance, because it does cost money, it does take time. It's not resource neutral.
And it pulls staff away from other duties, so if you do it too frequently, then the program doesn't function.
So what you want to do with these evaluations, when this is happening, and I'm just speaking of like experience that I've done in from previous work, is that you'll get a committee started, and what you want to get is a sustainability. So the evaluators will come in, they'll look at this, they'll create rubrics, they'll create tools, they'll create documents, and they'll train staff, right? So then you could get some of this work done. Let's say every 3 years, you
Right.
have all this information already, then evaluators come and have all of that, so there's less, less time commitment. But it does require a little bit of time and effort from staff, and that's.
I think if you could get something written, we will be presenting to Representative Snow's Education Committee regarding higher ed counselors. So I need something, at least bullet points, that we could include in the legislation to be able to have that funding. But I need some requirements that we need in code with flexibility to do other things, right? But I need the funding and the requirements that I need to include.
And to your point, I would then, it seems like 3 years, because you just get a legislation passed. You're gonna get the information in a year, try to implement it in legislation with everybody's input. Now we need a little time to see if it works, not every year, but every other, or maybe third year, see if what we put in place, it was effective.
And funding for that consistent, right? That's the thing. Okay, if you can get that to me.
Great, okay, sounds good.
All right, recommendation number 5. And I want to make a concession here to my original language, which was very helpfully toned down by Deputy Warden Jackson and Andrea. In keeping with best practice number one, again, the idea of higher education on the inside should look like higher education on the outside, and in collaboration with UDC college and university faculty and staff, should be primarily responsible for recruiting and enrolling incarcerated students in the programs. So again, I want to, and I couldn't be more glad that Dan and Deputy Warden Jackson shared the story that you just shared at the beginning of this meeting. That sounds like a tremendously bad outcome that I would like to avoid at all costs. Yeah, that seems like a really, really bad day. So there is no question that recruitment and enrollment across the board have to happen in collaboration with UDC. You know things that we don't. That concede the point. That all being said, and it's also true that, and Blake brought up this another negative scenario in which the kind of recruitment and enrollment process on the inside becomes this kind of nightmare of kind of flyers and sign-up sheets and families calling and so forth, which seems profoundly inefficient and bad. So all of that we want to avoid. That all being said, when we kind of survey the way that, especially tech, especially community colleges and universities do recruitment and enrollment, there are kind of standardized and fairly rigorous, actually, application processes that are reviewed by departments of corrections and then ultimately reviewed by an admissions committee at the institution that's offering the coursework and the degree, right? So just to give one example, the Bar Prison Initiative in New York, they have quite a substantial application process that involves written essays and so on that have to then be evaluated by a committee like you would, an admissions committee like you would at the kind of main campus. The acceptance rate for that program is about 1 in 7. The vast majority of people who are accepted into that program have to apply more than once. So it's a process that resembles the admissions process at the institution. So what we want to try and do is, in collaboration with UDC, make sure that the institutions who are offering the programming and the degrees have sufficient say over the admission into those programs.
So my question is, right now, the legislation has 2 higher ed counselors in both main facilities and 2 to oversee the county facility, jails. So does that mean in the major facilities, we need a third person to just be responsible for the applications, for the recruiting, do we need a third person that's in charge of enrolling and recruiting?
Well, I think Andrea, you speak to some of this in terms of like the work that happens, the amount of work that happens behind the scenes. I know there's mentions around overloading, the system. I think yes, we do. There needs to be a third person to handle the system as well. And then maybe, and just I'm spitballing right now, thinking right now. So maybe it's a joint appointment with the Department of Corrections and some other institution, right? So that way they share the burden of managing, if that's a potential idea. But ideally, you might want to have something like that, someone in there that might help.
Would it be funded to UDC, funded as one of these higher ed counselors to coordinate with UDC? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I just have an idea as well. So we have our case managers. The case managers are the ones that conduct those risk assessments I was talking about to identify the risk in different areas. When they identify risk with drug and alcohol problems, they're not the person that's going to say, well, I want to do a residential treatment program. They've identified a risk basically to inform our clinical staff, our LCSW, SUDCs, that this person needs this evaluation. And then it's up to them to really build what the plan is as far as residential treatment and outpatient. I almost feel like we could do the same with education, to identify that education risk And basically at that point, turn it over to these academic advisors to meet with these individuals to say, let's figure out what your education plan is as well. And start to help us build that plan in there as well. Those that need to start from the very beginning, that need that cost assessment, so we can see what is their comprehension levels. Is the plan to start with a high school diploma, or to say, well, according to this, you're a low risk because you've earned a high school diploma, but let's figure it out, you know, do they want to get into a vocational training program? Are they interested in their social or their associates, or do they have their associates? Now we're looking to work on a bachelor's degree. Have them help us build a case action plan.
So if that's up to the counselors, is 2 enough? Do you need 3 in the 2 major facilities? What do you, I just want to make sure if we're gonna do this, that we're getting what the people and the resources that you're needing.
May I, Andy, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, so on my end, it seems like this is a really the work of the university system. So I don't know exactly how these counselors work. I'm still relatively new to Utah, but that kind of admissions recruitment work should be, especially as we're moving towards a kind of BA program, it's going to have to mimic the university as closely as possible. And so I'm not certain exactly kind of what that counselor, that third counselor would be doing. It seems to me that may be the responsibility of individual schools.
And are you having, with these 2 counselors, are they supposed to be an expert in both the tech and in the higher ed, or are they, is one focused on one focused on another, or and the third person maybe helping to evaluate which way they're going to go? How do you see that being structured?
If I could jump in here, because I do have practical experience in this. It's been interesting to see as Dr. Bradbury and I have gone over the most recent admissions for Salt Lake Community College students inside of the prison. We have almost 10% of the incarcerated population of 13 college classes right now. We went through 220 of those admissions and looked at and very carefully at where they'd gone to high school, what their background was educationally. And it was shocking to us both, and I hadn't realized this, that out of those 225 or so students, less than 10 received their high school diploma from one of the high schools around the state. Every single one of those individuals received their either GED or their high school inside the prison system or in one of the county jails. It speaks to the population that we're talking about. So we're dealing with challenges and difficulties that we as educators don't really know and don't have access to. So I look at this, and to me, I just don't know how it would even work from a practical standpoint. Where I see this greatest need would be to provide, Deputy Warden Jackson with the proper support to fully implement the data system that he has in mind, because that data system is going to be able to indicate background and interest and degrees, and provide that, and through the case managers, it'll just immediately go to the institutions, and then we can register those students.
So just to add on to that too, so Director Parrish and I have been working with our DTS just to write up the specs on what we think is our missing piece or our puzzle piece when it comes to providing the right services to the right individuals at the right time. And inside the prison, the timing is hard with the determinate sentencing. A lot of times when we try to guess, we realize we're either too early, or most of the time we're too late. They've got a release date. There's not enough time to finish this program. We have it. But what we're building is basically a timeline. If you're familiar with the Gantt chart, that's basically what it is as well, to just figure out what are the goals we're trying to address, and when we believe is the right timing to have them into these certain programs and classes. And what it does is it creates a really good visual where you can see, well, yes, we want to get them an education, but we also have a need for a residential treatment program. where do we start on this timeline as well? And to make sure that we're not overwhelming this offender as well. That this offender doesn't have a job with UCI, trying to get their associate's degree, and then also we've got them in 3 different life skills classes trying to address their criminogenic risk. It really does look at the timeline they have with this, how to kind of put some target start dates of when we want things to start, so that we've got an ambitious target of where we want to be before release date. We're not overwhelming the offender, that they can see what the plan is as well. And the board of pardons can see the board as well too. Just a really good visual, rather than a bunch of jumbled dates and times. It just lays it out on a Gantt chart basically too.
And should be part of our housing strategy, right? Where we place people should be entirely driven by the need of that individual at a given time.
Yeah, it's a game changer. You talk to the board, they're so excited about it. The case managers, everybody who's seen the mock-up screens are excited. They think it's going to make a difference. And I think education plays a huge part in laying it out on a timeline with the dates we know. We just wait. I know our ETS resources have been really busy on other projects.
So yes, and maybe potentially we could work out what would that look like. I mean, is that what I'm hearing? That we need a third person, and then potentially we could work it out, what would that look like? I mean.
With the flexibility of where it's
Yeah,
needed.
because what I'm thinking, what I'm hearing you say is that there's this case management needs to happen on your side. And then what we're saying here on the higher education, so that there's also this other level that needs to happen in higher education, right? So there's academic, there's not just prescriptive of you gotta take this class, it's a little more behind that, right? So then as you have your own assessment, and higher education also has their own assessment, maybe this is a collaborative space where this person come in with the expertise, whatever the expertise would be, and help out. Help out assess, so we here and help out with higher education as well.
And that's how our system is set up too, is to identify, the risk assessment basically tells us, it helps us identify the need for additional assessment. Everything from those academic assessments to those drug and alcohol assessments as well. And with our case action plan, we use what we call milestone management. Goal, we've got the goal, but sometimes those goals can seem very overwhelming. So of course we break them down into milestones. Let's focus on this, then let's focus on that as well. So in education, somebody coming in who's been incarcerated or dropped out of school in 10th grade, just getting a high school diploma feels overwhelming. So we could say, well, let's just start with the first milestone, is to figure out what your comprehension is. And then we'll start to work on your high school diploma. Once we reach that milestone, now associates, now bachelors as well. And so I think when we were shown the articulation map, I think it would play in real well. We call them case action plans, but basically it would be to say, all right, part of your case action plan is the milestone to earn your associates. But inside this milestone, there are certain activities that need to happen. And we want to lay those out to articulate what needs to be accomplished in order to earn that degree as well. And then tying that into our system, now we can start to look at what are their lockdown times? Do they have any negative events? Are they on temporary restriction? Can they live in certain parts of the prison? Are there gang issues? Are there a million things that play into this? There's so many layers to get this right. But that articulation now would fit right inside our case action plan and give us some timelines to work at. To say we want to accomplish this before they see the board of pardons, because it allows the board of pardons to make an educated decision on when a release date will be. Helps our case managers tell the board that we want to accomplish certain things by certain timelines as well. And if somebody can be ambitious and we can do this in a certain timeline, evidence is there to show we've lowered their criminogenic risk. And it just helps the board make a more informed decision on when they believe someone should release. And it's an incentive to the inmates or returning citizens, because now it's like, look, if you're ambitious, there's the potential we could let the board know that if you've done everything we've asked you to do by this timeline, let's talk about an earlier release date. And we can start to show the public, like, this is everything they did. And we truly do believe that we have the risk, and we feel comfortable about releasing them from prison.
I
Again,
didn't want to see the
believing
recruitment
that-
get in the way of all of that, which I can see it happening. I'm sorry.
No, I think thank you. It seems like what you've described too, including articulation map, building that into a plan, becomes part of what's presented to the board.
Yes.
At some point earlier than later. And then tracking the progress of this individual on that becomes helpful. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I just want to make a comment, and I know that we're getting low on time, but David, you said they're something like 10% of, and I think you said 220.
So there are 2,500 incarcerated students.
Okay.
Potentially, whatever.
Returning prisoners.
Okay.
Prisoners up in the new facility, about 2,500, and we admitted the number was 224.
224. And what you said was, and it was enlightening to me. You said 10% or less came out, or in that group, came from what we think was a traditional high school education. And the reason that's so enlightening is this is not like a typical incoming freshman class.
No.
And I think that's important that we all have that in mind. And I'm not saying these things are not all achievable, but I think that's really important. You're saying the vast majority didn't come from that traditional educational path that most of the young people have when they're starting at our colleges and universities in the state. And that's enlightening to me and helpful. So
Yeah, it was to me as well, Senator, and I hadn't noticed that before, but it makes sense in light of what we've seen. I mean, these are students that they need the 900 level courses, that math classes that we do before they're ready for college, algebra and other such things. And, you know, I think our goals are so lofty, and as well they should be. There's a practical side to this, and I appreciate what the work that Deputy Warden Jackson has done on this. It's tremendous, and when it is fully in place, I see this as just a pretty simple system where we as institutions are able to draw upon that information and get those who are ready for that experience and have that interest as well. And I just to piggyback, I would hate to see us as educators going in and recruiting and perhaps interfering with all of the other things that are there as well, that are state mandated, therapy and sex addiction training.
And if we do this right too, it allows us to help the schools as well, to identify students that potentially are interested or are ready to, rather than those sign-up sheets and stuff like that. We can sort of say, this is how many individuals already have their high school diploma, their reading comprehension and math is already at a 10th grade level, they're interested in an associate's degree. Look at our needs list in our system and reach out to these individuals as well.
So just to circle back for clarification. Yeah. I feel like I'm trying to figure out where we land with everything. So the regional was to for programs to have, you know, that say of who gets along to the program. And I'm hearing, if I'm hearing this correctly, there's case management on the back that needs to happen around, you know, the potential pool of applicants. Right, like two different things, right? What I'm hearing is the potential pool of applicants is what's going to create, you know, the workload that you're talking about that needs to be managed. And then this is specifically saying that, well, the faculty and staff have, you know, for lack of a word, authority of figure out who's going to get in and do the enrollment and do all the assessments, right?
I think another, just to go back to what me and John Powers was talking about at the beginning, is part of this plan is to tell somebody who is interested in vocational training, okay, that's fine, but in the meantime, we really need to work on lowering your criminogenic risk in these other areas too. And if I'm incarcerated and you can show me that detailed map, that timeline that and you're saying, okay, so if I can show that I lowered my risk by this time, now I'm qualified for a vocational training program. Yes, okay, how do sign me up? How do I get into this class?
It comes in second.
I really want a good job when I get out here, but I understand what you're saying. You know, I might make a lot of money, but I've got to know the difference on, should I be hanging out at the bar spending my paycheck, or should I be home with my family too? And that's what we dig into the other risk factors.
I think we're out of time. I wonder if there's something we can
Yeah.
assign to the access group to.
Yeah, we, recommendation on that, here with the, just make an assignment to, you know, I'm watching Chris here with, this is what researchers do. He's salivating, he gives us this big question, and this is what we hope would get the discussion. We're pushing for time now, but for this one, and I also have to remind myself, it's not 2 + 2, there's hundreds of tech ed that just get the certification, which is the bill I ran last year, was to reduce that barrier so companies could employ them without being sued for negligence. Anyway, so, and Andrea, you've talked about the first day in as the journey of the first day out. I love that. So like this has to work together, and maybe this is the ultimate goal, but best practice, but maybe achievable, at least at this point, but we should aim at it.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go to your last slide and then we'll go to the next item. So, Andrea.
Last slide's an easy one. So the final recommendation, of course, is that higher education for incarcerated students should be funded at an appropriate level and on a continuing basis. So I wound up, again, was in Chicago for other purposes, wound up talking with Jennifer Lackey, who is of all things a philosophy professor at Northwestern, who operates their prison education program that is in some respects kind of analogous to ours. And, you know, at the end of our discussion, I said, okay, what's the one thing I take back? And she said, well, money. And it is important that money not be a kind of sinecure associated with one particular politician or provost at a university or college. It is important that funding be solid and ongoing.
So the legislation that I ran this year and passed for 2022 required that upon registering for the classes, that the basically these new counselors would be required to help them make sure they apply for a Pell Grant if applicable, or to promise scholarship, or to the scholarships and money that are already available. So that's in code right now. And I hope that having the access advisors is really going to actually help accomplish that, because they're the experts in that funding. Right, so, but I do know, I think we need to, in this legislation that I have, we need to take off the requirement that exists for them to pay for half of their education. Is that right? Is that still in there? So we need to make sure that's taken off, because I'm not sure that got taken off of my last bill. Yeah, so we need to include that.
And then back to the last slide, sorry, but back to David's
Up
point, how do we get them there with the 900 class? Is that part of the funding? Because when you go to a college university setting, if you've even set out a few years or have barely got you were on to that college university will have to help you with them. Is it, or some prerequisite courses? Or-
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So that would have to be part of the same funding.
Yeah. And initially, when we talked about this, you mentioned USHE would probably have some funding to help put towards a bank for incarcerated students. Is that correct? But so my question is, does USHE have funds that they could help put towards incarcerated students to help meet some of the needs? I mean, I think there was some kind of buy-in, some kind of, you know, put some skin in the game, but
That's the telephone surcharge. And it's not
But-
issues.
So I think let's be clear that there's the concern of how do individuals pay for their educations? And then how do we help provide education as an institution, right? And those are separate and both critical
What's
issues
the
to
student's
address.
share?
Right, because for the most part, our only real source of funding for education is through the telephone surcharge. And that mechanism isn't going to be viable long-term because we are transitioning from telephones to tablets to do a lot of that communication with family. And it's I think a public policy decision for you guys to determine whether you think families should be paying for those visits and continuing to support education in that way, or if there's a different mechanism we need to deploy.
So because the legislation required that they already apply for things, we need to take off that pay for half. And I think that we need to have next meeting, some recommendations laid out for how we suggest those payments be made, or for some skin in the game, and also through the scholarships. So if we could put that on for next meeting, I think we need to get that spelled out and understood so that the legislation that I run is eliminates many of these barriers. Because right now they have to pay half up front.
Yeah.
So they just don't even have that money, or they have, for sure they have to have it paid for from the outside. And the process is backwards. It needs to apply for everything first and then see what's left.
I'll come back to me, but so this funding, I think I see as a continual thing, right? We're supporting students inside the prison and then continue support outside, right? After for those that have been paroled, right? So when we think about, we not only think about the funding like scholarships, institutional funding, but we also think about what programming should happen at the institutions to mitigate, any type of potential, like leaving higher education is, they're trying to adapt to society, trying to adapt to like many demanding issues outside. So there needs to be a level of case management, so to speak, and that process and that bridge. And I think as we continue this conversation, we have to be mindful of what that bridge is going to look like in higher education as well, because other states have gone that direction where they actually start looking at how do we collaborate with different agencies where, where the information is shared across different platforms. And also how is higher education have a system in place for formerly incarcerated students.
So I also want to mention, tech colleges have very low costs anyway. The U has, in specifically, you apply, and then through that one scholarship office that you have, it says, here's all the scholarships that are available to you. We need to have that apply to incarcerated students, period, right? And if they're available for any of these other funds, but that's what we need to make sure next time when we talk about this, what is already set up within your institutions that can be modified to here instead of sticking to the rule that currently exists in prison. Okay.
Great point. Awesome discussion. Chris, thank you for all of your work on this. You'll send this out to everybody? Sure, thank you. We appreciate it. So if you want to send it over to Jared, you can do that out, yeah.
Senator Owens, can I just propose one other recommendation? We need to find ways to protect our incarcerated students as well. And what I mean by that, and I think it's been brought up, is not moving them around to these rural counties and stuff just to fill beds when they're in the program, but it goes even further as well. It's almost building education campuses within the prison as well. And I know if we had a representative from Division of Prison Operations, they could tell us 100 reasons why it's hard, but we'll have students who go back to their sections and they live with 50 other inmates who could care less about making that change yet. And so when I'm trying to study and it's loud in there, or they're still in the books that I've been given to read, or all sorts of problems as well. If we can find ways to build those education campuses, to say everybody in a vocational training program lives in these sections. And I think it would really help when it comes to like, all right, this is a privileged section. These are people that are enrolled in college that want to make that change. We can allow them to have laptops and stuff that we can allow in other areas, or different books or different binders would be so helpful.
And as a reminder, my 2022 legislation required that corrections consider the education programming before they consider a transfer.
Yes,
Yeah.
and we remind everyone of that language, and we actually just want to thank you for it because it's all we have to stand on right now. And I would say I wish it was effective, but it gets overlooked repeatedly. I think because there's other pressures and demands. I don't think it's because anyone wants to do the wrong thing. I just think there's a lot of need for movement, but to the extent that we could safeguard people to continue their educations, that's a huge win for us, and we really need to focus on that.
Thank you. Chris, go ahead. You had a question?
Just as a side note, and not to keep bringing up Illinois and so forth, but that bachelor's degree program, their initial cohort was a cohort of 20, and you could apply from any number of state penal institutions in Illinois. Those who were accepted into the program were actually transferred to Stateville, southwest of Chicago, in their own dedicated unit. So this kind of thing is a norm, not a norm, but it's a common practice. It can be done.
That sounds like a best practice.
Yeah.
139 we worked on to try to move, that you almost graduate to that, a different housing, and it would be more like a dorm than.
Huge incentive.
It is a huge
Yeah,
incentive.
so,
To Blake's point, we had a student last night approach me in the prison, and he dropped his math class because he cannot find any place that is quiet. One of our best students, he cannot find any place quiet to work on that statistics course on the in-housing units. It's a real issue.
Well, it sounds like that requires an actual physical, structural, does it not?
Yes.
I mean, how do you
Or just
separate?
grouping,
So
it would be
hard,
grouping.
Yeah, well, it just be grouping.
Yeah.
And I guess that's right.
It'd be to say, therefore, one of our big housing units that's broken down into sections, to say sections 1 and 2 of therefore is more like our education campus. It's closely related to the schools, to whatever, moving students in there. And as long as they're doing well and they're following the rules, there could be those extra incentives that could come. The ability to use like multi-purpose rooms for study groups. It was me and Andy Ison have talked too, the ability to say, this group gets those laptops or our Texas Instrument calculators. You know, you're not gonna find them throughout the prison, but in these sections that are allowed. So when officers are doing cell searches and stuff, they would know this is a privileged section. They're allowed these extra things to help them be successful.
And so assuming that's attainable, and it sounds like a great idea, if it's attainable, and it's also consistent with what Chris gave us, one of the first recommendations, is creating an environment that replicates to some extent this higher learning environment.
supporting each other.
Can you do that on your own, and how soon could you do it?
You need one.
I know I bring this up with our security staff once in a while. I've just proposed it just in little conversations. They've got reasons why it complicates things. I'd really like to hear what they would have to say, maybe share.
Maybe I just put in the legislation and consider grouping within the facility to encourage the education.
Yeah,
I didn't-
it would be so helpful. Me and Down talked about it as well too. We're hurting for security staff, as everyone knows. With direct supervision, sometimes we don't even have enough officers to put one in each section. But if I can clear out a whole section because they're all moving to the B-up building or the D-up building because they're in a vocational training program, now that's a whole section for 8 hours a day. Security doesn't have to watch because they're all in class, other than maybe a few stragglers that were sick that day, stuff like that.
And if I may, and I'm so grateful for the bill. The language though may need to be stronger. Just the mere fact that it asks corrections to consider, and we're not talking about programming, we're talking about the other side of things, the DPO. It's very easy for them to just say, consider it.
They always
It
revert
just-
to, we'll make the decision. that
So-
it's in the
So I
best
don't know
interest
that
of
So
it's
create
the
housing
prison.
groups. All right.
Yeah, I don't know.
That's,
I mean, legally, it doesn't really do much for us.
139
I would
that
say,
we worked on.
please look at it.
Melissa, so I tried to put it in place a few years ago.
We'll just add it to this bill.
Okay, but just to build that housing unit, to incentivize them to move there, and that's where you want to be. And if you don't want to be there, and you want to continue with your behavior, go somewhere else. Let these groups
Okay.
flourish.
I will just say create.
That's what's nice about having lawmakers as part of it.
It was so kind of inconvenient.
considerate and assume the best of all of us.
And we haven't even got to the money.
We're trying.
Yeah, that's.
Kind of.
So I just, really quick, I know we were running out of time, just, I haven't had the chance to learn about the new facility out, by the airport, right?
Yeah.
Is there space there for students? Because we're talking about creating an optimal environment for them to be together in the residence hall setting, for them to move. So is there, or is this something we need to consider? And is there space, or there's already limited space, and can we think about the possibilities of leaving it to lawmakers?
There's a
Creating
house.
space.
Yeah, we have dedicated classroom space. It might not be, as some people are used to, Salt Lake Community College space that they always get to keep their supplies in. It might be Salt Lake Community College in the morning and then another institution later in the afternoon. So it's shared classroom space, like any university really. But I think it's sufficient for our needs at the moment. It depends on how we grow.
What about like space for students? Well, I guess follow-up is that space also available for students if they wanted to work? Let's say that they're not being put in dorms yet in their own unit, so if they need a quiet space, is there one provided?
There's space. I think one of the big concerns is segregation. There for a while, we tried to keep certain gangs segregated. And by putting them in certain housing areas, it kind of limited what resources that they had available to them as well. And so it's just that juggling act of making sure that everybody has equal opportunities, but also separating those who want to make a change from those that don't. But there's space. I think there's space.
Okay, we'll let you guys kind of continue to talk about that, and we'll support it with legislation and keep working the. All right, Chris, thank you. These the powerful discussion, and I think it ties in a lot. We've even mentioned some funding and some Pell Grant, which are the next two items on our agenda. So funding needs, we talked about some of those things, and we put them in the bill. Suggestions recommended by the Department of Corrections. And Andrea, this is your portion.
Sure, so we have a detailed spreadsheet, but I'll just give you the high level version and then send the detail out if that works for you guys. Okay. So, some of our estimates just that we put together in this last week was really, let me backpedal. So we just recently submitted a building block request to the governor's office to include education in their budget. So we asked for two things in that building block. We asked support for and what I'm calling is an intergenerational person who really focuses on those people who, and I would say namely children who are secondary victims of parents who are incarcerated, and we really want to focus a specific program or set of programs around addressing that population so that we don't have future kids who grow up and become incarcerated. So that's a new thing for UDC. We're asking for the funding. This individual, if we get the funding, would oversee our new Women and Infants program, which we are like months away from starting. And we have opened up a job posting to hire that individual, even though we haven't received the funding. So the Women and Infants program, wherein right now when moms who are incarcerated deliver their babies at the University of Utah, they have to either leave their baby with a loved one or they become part of another system, which is our child welfare system. That the change for moms that are screened in and could be in this program, they would bring their babies back to prison with them for a limited duration, and then we would extend them together. So that was part of our building block request. The other part was to have ongoing funding support for our tablet program, because we went out on a limb there. We asked for federal funds during COVID, we received those funds, we exhausted those funds, purchased every tablet that we could. It's not enough tablets to cover all the individuals who are incarcerated, so we have roughly coverage for half of them. And more importantly, we have no ongoing funding to support the software. We contract with APDS, American Prison Data Systems, to supply all of the support to make those tablets secure, to put programs on them. We've just loaded a ton of programs from Davis Voc Tech on those tablets. So what's really cool is we've demonstrated we can do this. We can get the tablets, we can make them useful, we can put them in the hands of the individuals we serve. But we've never received any ongoing support to make sure we have funding to, and I would say it's not limited to just tablets, it's all technology. Like, we really have never been supported educationally to do the things that we want to do, right? And so a part of us is just like, we're just gonna do it anyway and hope for the best, right? Because you can't get started unless you get started, right? So we've put it ourselves out there, but now we're asking for the ongoing support to make sure that these programs we've initiated remain viable and really do the work that we've, set ourselves up to do.
That'll be helpful.
I'm sorry.
No, I was just gonna, it'll be helpful, and it also, that will come in front of the OCJ, right,
Correct.
Okay.
And I don't get to control this process, I just get to write it up, submit it, and then hope for the best.
Which is the representative point earlier, that it's nice, because I chair that committee on the Senate side, so we know that's coming, and we can make sure we help prioritize it. This is awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I was just gonna say that it's so important that we crystallize that and the timing is right now. to
Yeah.
Move that forward. What's really interesting is how that relates to what Chris had as his second or first recommendation about a statement from our leadership.
Yeah.
So getting our statement from our leadership, and there's the old saying, put your money where your mouth is, and if we can get that kind of support, then it follows that I think was going to help in these appropriation requests too. But I think in this day and time, technology and making sure that you're funded with that is critical.
I would also like, if you could, kind of a 10-year accounting of what the phone surcharge has brought in, where it's been spent, what's going on with that, because if this group is to help have a new plan for paying for education, I think we need to see the track record of where that is so that we can understand that moving forward.
And we're not out of funds from that,
Right.
but it's limited on how we can spend it,
Right.
So we
include
couldn't
that
use
in the
it to,
include that. Okay.
The other thing that we acknowledge, so this is sort of separate from our building block, I just wanted to be clear, because it's a little messy otherwise, is that there's some other needs that we didn't ask for the governor to support that we still think are important for corrections in order to provide education. And we're asking for 1.6 million in one-time and 3 million in ongoing to support our educational programs. This includes our tablets, laptops, software, interns. Interestingly, we have a lot of incarcerated people that help with our programs, but we were the least well paid of all. So we were paying 75 cents an hour for those individuals, when a lot of the other correctional industries was paying $2 an hour for interns or employment. So we were asking for the additional funding to raise how much we pay those interns and to increase the number that we have. And we have some estimates of where they would go and what we need.
And all of this is ongoing funds.
That's
For
ongoing.
tablets.
Not all of it. Sometimes, some of it's one time. Like if we need to purchase some laptops and we need to purchase some calculators, those are one time.
But there are
They do get upgraded.
maintenance and upgrades, right, that you need to include in that pricing.
Yeah. And then I think we don't have sufficient office support. Like somebody has to do all the data entry and, we sort of scramble and struggle in that way. So we're asking for some additional office support. This is a huge operation. We have no dedicated administrative support for this program. So I think it's a more than reasonable ask to say we need some administrative support to do this well.
And that's in addition to the 3 counselors.
That's in addition to the counselors.
Okay.
Can I add something to that really
Sure.
fast? I talked about the case action plan, but in order for the different colleges and stuff to participate and put their data in it, the feedback we always get is, well, now I gotta put it in Utopia, and now I gotta put it in, in O-Track and stuff like that. So we want just a little bit more support staff to just help us keep the data entry and take that burden, off the shoulders of the different schools that we work with.
Is there no collaboration digitally?
And we've actually found ways to give them a little bit more access into our tracking system as well, while keeping certain things protected. And that's been helpful as well, but it's still, at the end of the day, it's a lot of data entry And we just felt like we could use at least one more clerical staff member to help with that with our education team.
And then our final ask for corrections, I think we need some kind of cloud storage mechanism. It can be Google or some other provider wherein we would be able to store these really critical documents. And I'm not talking just educational ones, right? I want them to have a copy of their birth certificate and all the other things, but notably from your bill, we want a reasonable way to deploy, how do we track what they've achieved while they're incarcerated and then send them on their way when they exit and they have a secure cloud stored place to retrieve all of those documents. And it helps us too, if they return, then we're not scrambling, spending money. We spend money every time we have to get a new social security card. Well, they spend the money, right? They have to pay for it and it's expensive for them to get a new birth certificate, a new social security card. So I think it would be helpful to come up with a cloud storage approach to storing these documents that they can exit and locate easily.
Offsite, cloud storage.
Yeah.
And I have to believe the amount of data you're talking about is, I mean, in terms of what they do with, it's not that much, so that would be a minimum cost. It's a great idea. Essentially, what you do is create a file for each one, so that when they leave, they can access the file.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, and I just, Representative Ballard and I talked, is when we had one interview with Google, we probably should look at some others, but they can set up an email account. It remains dormant during the duration of their incarceration. It goes live when they exit and all their documents would be stored in that Google account. And in addition, they have a Gmail, right? So there'd be a way to correspond and keep track.
Great. Okay, thanks for your input. I
Yeah.
kind of see the value of it. That's kind of your punch list of what you.
That's what we've got so far. I mean, we try to really think about our needs and be reasonable, but I just want to remind everyone, normal public education in Utah was funded during COVID. They all got tablets and technology and upgrades, and we sort of got overlooked and we were left to scramble. And I don't know that we did the best job. I think we did a lot of packet work because we didn't want to shut down education, but we didn't really have the tools at our disposal to go digital, right? So I think we've learned our lesson, and a prison setting more than anywhere else is unfortunately plagued with lockdowns, with lots of things that can disrupt our education. So we need a technological solution to continue education. And of course, we also support in-person education as our primary delivery system. So it's not an either or, but we just recognize corrections is a place where things get locked down frequently.
So make sure to get ongoing support for tech, right?
Yeah.
For future iPads, for future downloads, whatever you need.
So Andrea, just a suggestion. One is you can reduce all that to your spreadsheet and get it to these two lawmakers.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, I would recommend to Senator Owens, who happens to chair education appropriations. Am I right about that or not?
I'm with the executive.
But I can help. I sit on education appropriations. We're scheduled for a meeting in November. And I would love to have you come and we allocate a very short portion of that to, so let's plan on that. I'll make sure that we get.
Yeah, and we'll do a walkthrough of where we're at with the telephone surcharge, because it's not depleted. I know it exists. That's one of our goals, is to use it entirely, right? I feel like that's a burden on us. We have to make sure that we're being good, utilizing those resources that we already have, right? Especially if they came from families. There's an extra burden there. But I don't think that's how we're gonna fund this long-term, right? It's gonna be depleted in some short order.
So if you'll help remind me, and I will make sure we get you on the agenda. It's Representative Eliston, and I can't remember who is.
But technically, this funding would come through law enforcement and
Well,
criminal justice and not education.
well, in my mind, it ought to be coming through education, because we are here in higher ed. This is a higher ed program. That's the way I
So
see
does
it.
it come to higher ed appropriations?
That's what I think.
Yeah.
And they may disagree with me, but I think helping us turn the corner and realize that this is a partnership with corrections, but this is an education program of our state.
Yeah, okay.
And Senator Grover, who's the
Well,
House chair?
Right now I'm vice chair with so
Okay.
because Kelly Miles is in.
Okay, let's,
So we'll do the same. We'll have you just, while you're there, report to both both of our
Okay.
committees. How's that?
It'll be my pleasure.
Okay.
Are you
I think
on
the more
executive
people that
approach?
see it, the
No,
legislature
but
is.
the executive,
Yeah,
yeah, for
officer
sure.
and criminal justice. So
Okay.
I'll send a text right now.
thank you for that.
Sure, and I think other people submitted some things my direction, so I will let them speak to their own funding, or if you want me to represent you, I'm happy to. So Davis Technical College responded, and so did Andy from Utah Prison Education Project. And if there was other people that had funding needs, let me know. That's the ones I'm aware of.
Snow as well.
So,
Well, yours would come up.
We
I mean,
don't
if it's
have
structured the way it is
appropriations in
now, it'd come
November.
up through corrections,
Pardon?
wouldn't
We
it?
don't have appropriations in November, it's
Unless-
only
unless we-
October.
Unless
We
it's
wait
changed.
for a week and a half.
education appropriations?
All appropriations are only October.
It's on my calendar
For
for
November?
November, Tuesday of November. At least.
Well, look, I think we're only every other month and I don't have any appropriations for November.
You show one in October.
Because we're only every other month for appropriations. Can you get it ready, Andrea, by October? That's like 2 weeks.
Okay,
This
Let-
legislative ask,
I
'cause we
think,
only have October.
I think this stuff is too important for me to not show up and do, so I'll do my best.
I'm looking at my calendar to see the same representative, so good point.
So I'm mistaken, so.
No, it's good to look at it, otherwise we would have got to November and now what, so
Yeah.
let's push for that, Andrea. And I need to understand though, like, so Davis Tech will put in, what about the other?
We have a very small ask for just, again, tech upgrades and then also to better fund the automobiles that are used in our automotive program.
Is there any
Which
program?
I think that ask could come through Andrea. I don't think it necessarily has to come.
I guess the question would, if it came through Andy, that would be owned by UDC, right? Versus owned by Davis.
Yeah, and typically the equipment is what we purchase, so just,
Okay,
I'm not saying that we're going to part ways with any of our partners, but it gives us the flexibility that should we still own the equipment and we can reestablish a new contract.
Yeah.
We've learned the hard way, that's probably the best way.
and if you have programs and there's no request from anything in Gunnison?
That includes,
Like-
our request includes
Okay.
Gunnison, because
Okay,
they're
good.
part of our education.
Are you talking about Snow College? I know through our work group that Michael Medley proposed, I think it's about $500,000 to start providing general education in the Gunnison facility that it doesn't exist right now.
Yeah, so would that be a similar model what Slick is doing, or would that kind of? same
Yeah,
what Tech is
in our
doing?
most recent meeting with Mike, that was my recommendation that he go try to take a look at what we've done and approach it similarly down in the Gunnison, in the facility. That will make it easier for us when those movements and transfers do happen for whatever reason. The Salt Lake Community College student, we have a whole handful of students that are very close to finishing their associate's degrees that have been transferred down there. They're still down there, and then Snow College then could just pick them up, and vice versa, back and forth. It would ease up the work for
That
us.
was my initial concern is losing them in 16 institutions, 8 tech,
Without question.
yeah, is that, and they're so vulnerable anyway, we have to track them
Yeah,
closely.
without question. Just to clarify, Tim Sheehan at Salt Lake Community College's request, would you like that to go through?
Yeah, I mean, I think where we're struggling here is that I don't know if UDC is going to be sort of facilitating the funding and passing. We could be the pass-through mechanism to, and contract with third parties, or we can propose the Salt Lake Community College model, which is direct funding, and we just partner. We still have a contract, right? But we aren't providing the funding to you.
Yeah, we're not contracted, like Davis Tech is, so.
That's where I was, I'd like to go from USHE, where's the USHE, USHE should oversee the model, I would think, right? And help with this. This is a problem, this is a.
We have two models, we're making it work, right? But
Let's get one though. So, but somewhere in USHE, there's transfers and everything takes place on your system, moving, right?
Yeah, for example, the Davis Tech students are Davis Tech students, even though they're funded by contract by UDC. So I don't know if you just go to UDC funding or which right now is the telephone surcharge, right? Largely is. Move that over, but Russ, I don't want to put you on the spot. I'm not going to solve this problem in the negative 5 minutes we have left. But you may have some thoughts or observations from Russ from our finance team.
Yeah, Russ, would you give us input? I
Would you
apologize,
suggest
everyone. We are over time, but we do need to kind of learn about this real quick.
Yeah, I know there are strong feelings on support or not support for both methods. Some people feel really strongly that all the funds should go to the educational institution as a line item to support the prison. Others feel very strongly that it ought to go to the prison and have the prison contract with the providers of the education. Both models are working, both models work fine, but they are different models and different people have strong opinions on which way it goes.
Because that's the same question for my legislation for the counselors. Where do we want it housed? Where's the funding come from? Where does the accountability go to?
And you know, that is really the challenge, because the accountability is both. The prison can't succeed without the educational institution. The educational institution can't even get in the door without the prison. And so that's why something like this council is so important, because neither party can be held accountable on their own.
We got some sorting out to do.
We have some.
And it occurs to me that Chris, it's worth making an outreach to ask whether those resources come through corrections or through education channels. Having said that, Andrea, I just sent you a text.
I did, I saw it.
So,
Check my calendar.
and I apologize to everyone, the education appropriations meeting is in October, and I'm going to make sure that we get you on the agenda, but I'm going to tell them, Andrea, that we're going to limit it to 10 minutes, so. But I'm part of that committee, and
I
I'll be
will
there to help.
speak fast and furious.
And have some figures, so maybe a PowerPoint?
Of course.
Okay,
Yes.
but I'll help you out. I'll let you know if we're successful in getting it on.
Okay.
But somewhere along the line, y'all gonna have to figure out where the conduit is.
Yeah, and the OCJ will be part of that too, but also the higher ed has to have that on their agenda.
So I think I talked to you about having this education advisors on your education committee. I don't know if it's, maybe we need it for November, is that like, so that it's ready? But or October, so at least it's opening a bill file.
October is packed right now.
Where do you have it in then?
We've been asked to take up the harmful materials in schools. That's gonna take a lot of time, but anyway, you might be able to get your few minutes in November, so I
I
told
think
you
we
that.
did, yeah, we just need it as a bill file, so that it takes priority.
It has to be brief.
Yeah, well, I think that's all it is. We're gonna come with a list of items of what we want in the bill.
Okay.
So that it could be, I mean, we could even do that in October to just say, hey, these are the needs, this is your list of what it is, for the committee, like, take this on as a bill file.
We'll make sure we get you. Getting back to Andrea and this discussion though, for your request, which is, this is part of it.
Right.
Is I think in order for me to get it on education, I'm gonna take a position, and maybe I'm the only one, that the majority of this, the gentleman back in the corner says it's combinations, coordination, and that's why this council is so important. But I think if we're gonna get serious about this, we have to recognize that this is an educational offering. And in some ways, there may be people that would disagree, but in some ways, this is as much education offering to these people that is at University of Utah or SLC to the students that walk in the door. And so, and I also think, going back to Chris' presentation, we think we can keep it in the education area. It will support the sustainability of funding too. And so I think getting us off on the right track to begin with is going to be important. At least that's kind of the position I would take. You guys will have to carry that ball, you know.
Thank you, Representative. I just want to voice that I agree with that. To me, having the institutions that are providing academic degrees held responsible to corrections seems like a recipe that would.
Powerful conversation, wisdom in your thinking and yours, so I apologize as chair for letting us just go over time, but we couldn't get out of that and great stuff in this conversation. So we do have a few other items on the agenda that we're going to need to move if we can, or if there's something critical we have to address. Otherwise, we'll move them to November 9th, next future meeting.
Do we need to add another hour to that?
Yes. Yeah, we need an hour.
I think we'll actually, yeah.
Let's see, if we go 11, this is only future meeting, 10:55 to 11, that's 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, we might need more than. So
So 9 to 12.
Well, maybe we go 3 hours.
10 to 12, 9 to 12.
Yeah, and the second chance Pell, I have some very pretty slides that are very simple. I tried to distill everything. I'll just send that out to everybody. So that's become very important, how this program is administered, which institutions come in, how do you become a prison education program, how do the funds become administered. Part of this data is sorting out of budgets. Is gonna have to be part of that too.
Thank you.
And I just want to add an announcement that we have our final interviews today, this afternoon, to hire our education specialist. So that's a deputy warden level civilian, however, new position that we were given, thankfully, and we're really excited to hire that person. I know they're gonna be smarter than me and have great ideas, so we'll have another mind to think with soon.
We bring them.
They're coming, they're
They're on
hired
this
in
committee.
part to be on
Okay.
this committee, so
Perfect.
we're gonna get you guys a good one, I promise.
And we're pushed for time. After November, we can't, we won't meet again. So unless after session this continues. So we are pushed for time, but your voice and what we're offered here today is really giving some foot and legs underneath this. And now going forward, it's fun to watch. This is how it works on the Hill. Give me 5 minutes, no, 10.
I'll take 5.
I love it. And that's what you do, is push for something you're passionate about, and it doesn't get traction unless you have a champion on the Hill. So thank you, everybody. We'll go ahead and move other items into the agenda, and let's plan on 3 hours. And maybe we can order lunch in or something. We'll talk about that. All right. Thanks, everybody, for your input. Attending is critical. With that, I'll entertain one final motion. To adjourn. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Have a safe day, everybody.
Deputy Jackson.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Yeah.